Oline and wicked regards once again to all who care and dare to listen. This is JLL with another preview of Planetary Tantra. And as usual, you can find the entire talk on that page of Nematta, and I provide the link below. Just to update you with how I'm progressing in my overhaul of Nematta, with specific goals to make Planetary Tantra more accessible, you will find that on the landing page, linked here, there is a rectangle, and inside that rectangle, which is titled War of Games, are the talks I previewed here on YouTube. And as a matter of fact, you don't even have to go and register as a visitor to access those talks. Because they are on the landing page, anyone can access them directly. So this procedure accords with my long-time determination to keep Planetary Tantra absolutely free. I am not here to create a cult of Planetary Tantra like the cult of Scientology. And even though I admit that Nematta is an educational cult, I say that upfront in order to be completely transparent. I mean it in the benevolent sense of the word. So any specific study or practice, from bingo to flying drones, to flying gliders, to rock climbing, to anything you can name that appeals to a specific group of people and that requires that you follow certain principles and rules, is a cult. So Nematta is an educational cult, but the material on Planetary Tantra is unique and distinct from all the other content on Nematta. So as I say, anyone who stumbles upon the page can listen to these talks. So I am not a cult leader recruiting people into Planetary Tantra so that I can brainwash them and change their identities and make a lot of money off them, because I receive absolutely nothing whatsoever for Planetary Tantra, never have and never will. Just wanted to be clear on that. I do accept donations for my other work, which reflects my studies and investigations and experiments through the entire course of my life. So the other courses on Nematta reflect what I have learned, and in that case, yes, those who choose to donate and have access to all the units on the school are welcome to do so. The other point I want to make is that you might be wondering, you're certainly asking by now, well, John, stop beating around the bush. Tell us exactly and precisely what the practice of Planetary Tantra is. Give us the simple and basic instructions. Right? Well, actually, I've already done that, and I've been doing it for years. The situation is, however, that I do require your patience, because those instructions are not presented right now in such a way that you can go directly to them and proceed A, B, C to know what the practices are, to know what the goal of those practices are, and to undertake the practices. So I'm getting there. You will have that eventually. But I want to advise you that at the moment, that panel I've created on the landing page for Course 16 Planetary Tantra contains orientation material. It answers questions that arise when you approach Planetary Tantra. And it talks about the background of it as well, the framing concepts, and the metaphors I use, which are primarily three: the metaphor of dreaming, the metaphor of gaming, and the metaphor of movie making, which is called the cinematic metaphor. So what you find there now is not the explicit instructions of how to practice PT, but they are coming, and they're coming soon. So the title of his talk is, "You Are Not a Divine Spark Trapped in Matter." And I'm including this talk in that panel as a tool of orientation. This subject of the divine spark, in quotes, comes up often. And it so happens, well, you know about connotations, don't you? Well, what are the connotations of the word divine spark? Just as I pronounce it right now. I've found, and this has been reinforced by people who've written me on this issue, that the term divine spark has certain connotations which some people might equate with the basic teachings of the Gnostics of the ancient mystery schools. I can understand why that would happen. Nevertheless, I do my very best, my level best, as they say, to distinguish the metaphysical theory, or the religious doctrine, you could say, of the divine spark from what you find in planetary tantra, so that you don't bring erroneous and misleading connotations coming from that term into your interest in planetary tantra. In fact, I assure you, you can completely eliminate the term divine spark from your syntax, and you're better off in doing so because it has nothing at all to do with either the theory or practice of planetary tantra. Clear enough? I have to add, for complete clarification, and I've said this before, there are interpretations of Gnosticism that are circulating out there on the internet, and some of them receive hundreds of thousands of views, and some of them come to you in high production documentaries and presentations with certain religious scholars and certain let's say pop gurus, and they are really, really impressive. But in those versions of what the Gnostics taught, you find embedded the concept of the divine spark. And you find that those who are propagating that version of Gnosis, actually they're talking about Gnosticism, they're not talking about the living Gnosis today because they don't know what it is and they don't practice it. But you find that those who are promoting that version will assume that, yes, Gnostics claimed that we are sparks of divinity trapped in a material nightmare. You will hear this said over and over again. And I've refuted this extensively. But in this talk, I'm going to take a slightly different direction with that refutation. And I'm going to go back to the origins. Where did this concept come from? This concept of the divine spark trapped in matter, assuming that matter is evil, assuming that matter, the material substance of the world, is the product of a satanic demiurge, and assuming that even the material processes of nature are not directed by divine and benevolent forces, but they are directed by this same satanic adversary. You see, that's the scenario that goes along with the commonly held interpretation of divine spark. So let me take you back to the origins of that concept. In order to do so, I make two references. There is the ancient Asian origin, and then there is the more recent origin that comes out of a specific tribal tradition of religious doctrine. So, what is the most ancient Asian origin of this notion? Well, it goes back to the Vedas and the Hindu yogis of the past. And the story says that these wise men dedicated themselves to renouncing the world so that they could go back to the origin of the world. And so the goal of the ancient practices of yoga was to reach God, reach the source, the divine, the absolute, Shiva, the ground of consciousness and being. Or to use the full expression in Sanskrit, Sat Chit Ananda, the ground of being, consciousness, and bliss. And that was the sole and universal goal of yogic practices, right? And presumably some of these yogis, rishis, mahatmas, whatever you want to call them, actually achieved that. They achieved the ultimate realization of God. And what did they have to say about it? Well, they all said the same thing, that God is yourself and yourself is God. So your true identity, stripped of the illusions you have about yourself, shows that yourself is identical with the divine self. So in the syntax of that ancient system, you find the duality, the dichotomy of higher and lower self, which, by the way, you do not find anywhere in the living gnosis today, nor in planetary tantra. I just don't use those terms. Now, here's an example, fairly recently, of the perennial instruction of these Vedic Hindu yogis. It goes to the recognized master, Ramana Maharshi. He lived between 1879 and 1950, and he is indisputably one of the most revered gurus from India. He's from Tamil Nadu, which is southern India, an area I know or used to know quite well. And of course, if he died in 1950, well, he died a decade before the wave of gurus, yogis, and mahatmas hit the Western shores. So, of course, in the 60s, you find the Beatles associated with Maharishi Mahesh, and you find various other yogic celebrities, such as Sri Chinmoy, Parahamsa Yogananda, who's a little earlier, one of the first, and Muktananda and others. And they were big celebrities in the 60s and 70s. But let's take a look at Ramana Maharshi and see what he said, because I would regard him as a faithful representative of that ancient yogic tradition based on the goal of reaching the source, the absolute, the divine. There are many quotes from Ramana Maharshi, by the way. You can easily find them on the internet. And quite a number of these quotes, in my opinion, are pretty saccharine and innocuous. I could well imagine that someone would start a Chinese cookie business, a fortune cookie business, and you could easily put a large number of Maharshi's sayings in fortune cookies. That's the level of intellectual depth and intellectual, what shall I say, substance of these sayings. But here is one particular saying from him. Quote, "The highest goal of man is to inquire, who am I? And realize the self. If a human being does not try to realize this, he lives in vain." End quote. And the self in that quote is capitalized. So there you have it. You could put it in a fortune cookie, and that is the sum and essence of what the ancient rishis and mahatmas and Vedic yogis were attempting to do. Now, whether they did it or not is one thing. I'll give them a credit. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's say they did it. They achieved the mystical experience of the ultimate realization of the absolute. Parasamvit, Shiva, call it what you will. Okay, I'll give them that. I don't have so much an issue with that. Anyway, how would I confirm it one way or the other? Confirm it or deny it? I have an issue with what they said about that supreme mystical experience. So that's what I will talk about in the remaining part of this audio, which you can find on the page linked below.